a fortress under siege, but the enemy wears no armor, only smiles and complaints. Each morning the guardian entered the world believing calm was enough. No need for armor, no sword at the side, just reason and goodwill. The office lights buzzed overhead, soft as always as the hum of computers and muted conversations filled the space. But something had shifted. A presence lingered, not in volume or chaos, but in the slow erosion of peace. It came in comments dressed as concern. "You always work through lunch, dunna you get lonely?" In laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. "You were so rigid about your routines. Lighten up." And in the silence after every interaction, the kind that echoed louder than the words themselves. The colleague wasn't overtly cruel. In fact, to many they seemed warm, engaging, helpful, quick to offer opinions cloaked in charm. But to the guardian, each encounter ended with a weight that didn't belong to them. The feeling was hard to name at first. Not anger, not fear, just depletion. By the end of each day, the guardian felt as if their thoughts had been quietly borrowed and twisted. Was it really that big a deal to share more? To bend just a little? They replayed the exchanges during the slow walk home, and again in the quiet moments before sleep. Logic said nothing terrible had happened, but peace whispered otherwise. Sitting alone one evening, a phrase surfaced. It was not a voice but a memory, a whisper from the old books stacked near the window. "It is not what happens to you but how you react to it." Epictetus. The guardian paused. Could it be that the damage wasn't from the words said, but from the meaning given to them? Could the quiet exhaustion be a signal not of harm inflicted, but of a gate left open? They returned to the thought the next day and the next. In every interaction they began to listen differently, not just to the person speaking, but to their own breath, their own thoughts. Were they reacting, defending, explaining away what needed no justification? A memory stirred. Childhood days pretending to be the guard of a great castle, standing tall against imaginary foes. Now in adulthood the same role seemed to return, not with play swords or wooden shields, but with boundaries drawn from clarity. Perhaps the citadel needed guarding after all, not from physical invasion, but from slow erosion. The guardian realized they had been watching the wrong battlefield. The real threat wasn't loud. It smiled. It lingered. It asked for nothing, while taking everything. That evening, with dusk settling through the blinds, the guardian sat still. They didn't replay the conversation. They didn't analyze tone or search for insult. Instead, they asked a quieter question. Where did I grant permission to be harmed? They didn't have the full answer yet, but they knew one thing. The path forward wouldn't be about changing others. It would begin with watching their own mind more closely than the mouths of others. But what if I could choose not to react at all? A king does not weep when denying entry to his gate. The guardian stood in the doorway of the family dining room, holding a plate and a breath. The table was already full of food, voices, memories, and the kind of invisible expectations that collect over years. They smiled politely, slid into their seat, and nodded at the familiar cast of characters. But beneath the surface, a ripple of tension stirred. Aunt Leona began, as always, with warmth laced in assumption. "You're still living alone, aren't you? That can't be healthy." The guardian responded with a soft laugh. "It's peaceful." She tilted her head. "Peaceful or lonely?" The fork hovered mid-air. A sip of water stalled the reply. These weren't the daggers of open hostility. These were the slow drips, tiny invasions disguised as love, as care, as tradition. And each one pressed against something in the guardian's chest, a pressure that used to be dismissed as familial concern, now felt like erosion. That night, back in their own space, the guardian lit a single candle. The flame flickered steadily, casting shadows across the room. They opened Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and read, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." The simplicity struck them. Boundaries, they realized, were not about confrontation. They were about design. A wall isn't built to shame the outside. It's built to protect what matters within. So the guardian began small. The next family dinner came as they always did, with the same patterns. But this time, when Uncle Bram launched into a long critique of the guardian's life choices, masked as jest, of course, they interrupted gently. "I'm actually not open to discussing that today." He blinked, surprised. "It's just a joke." "I understand. Still, I'd prefer we talk about something else." The air shifted, not heavy, just different. A momentary stillness. Then someone changed the subject, and the moment passed. Afterward, the guardian didn't feel triumphant. They felt calm. That was new. They began to name what drained them. Not out loud, but internally. The friend who only called to complain. The colleague who manipulated through praise. The family member who offered affection only when agreement followed. And slowly they drafted the blueprint of their citadel. Its gates, its sentinels, its sacred interior. And then came the harder part. Keeping the gate closed, kindly, but firmly. Some resisted. "You've changed," they said. "You're not as fun anymore. You used to be so easygoing." And in each phrase the same subtext. "You were easier to manipulate before." The guardian breathed through it. "I'm still me," they'd reply, "just clearer." They learned to speak in, statements. "I feel drained when we focus on this," instead of, "You're always negative." They learned to be precise. "I need this evening for myself," not, "maybe later." And they learned above all to be consistent. Still, the work was not over. With each new wall raised, a new attempt to scale it came. Through guilt, through charm, through reminders of shared history, the guardian stood firm, not cold, not closed, just defined. Because now, they understood something essential. A fortress does not apologize for having walls. It offers peace to those who honor them. Still, some enemies scale walls with flattery or rage. When a fire finds no air, it dies. The guardian entered the cafe just before the lunch crowd settled in, choosing a table near the window where the outside world still moved in quiet rhythm. Light filtered through the glass, cutting lines across the wooden floor. Their tea arrived, steaming gently, and for a moment all was still. Then came the group. Familiar voices, familiar energy, quick, sharp, unfiltered. These were people the guardian had once laughed with easily, but lately, something had changed. Beneath the banter was a current, almost imperceptible, yet heavy. "You still doing that silent morning routine thing?" one of them asked with a smirk. The guardian smiled softly. "Yes," another chimed in louder. "Still pretending you're a monk or something?" Laughter followed, not cruel, just casual. And yet, it bit. In the past, the guardian might have tried to explain, might have offered some gentle insight about focus, discipline, the value of stillness. But today, something quieter stirred. A memory of Seneca's words. True happiness is not needing excitement to feel alive. So they took a breath and offered only, "Interesting." It hung in the air, neutral and light. A response that gave nothing. No defense, no fire. Conversation shifted elsewhere. The guardian watched it pass like a storm overhead. Loud, swirling, but not touching the ground beneath their feet. This, they realized, was the gray rock. They had learned the idea not through books, but through exhaustion. Through days when trying to reason or explain only fed the flames. Toxicity, they saw now, often thrives on reaction. Take that away, and the storm loses its shape. In the days that followed, they practiced it with quiet precision. When a colleague gossiped, they nodded without agreement. When a friend's sarcasm turned personal, they said simply, "I see." When baited with guilt, they replied, "That's your view." Each time they stayed grounded, calm, flat, unmoved. It wasn't numbness. It was choice. They still cared, just not about the drama. And it worked, mostly. The provocateurs grew bored. They shifted their targets. The guardian found more silence between encounters, more space to breathe. The citadel stood stronger, but not everyone faded so easily. One afternoon, an old acquaintance called out across the street, waving them over. "Too good to talk to me now?" The voice laughed, loud enough to turn heads. The guardian approached, slowly, calmly. "Hello." "You act like you're better than everyone," came the retort. "What happened to you?" The guardian looked at them, not with anger, but with a stillness that unsettled. "Nothing happened. I just stopped reacting." There it was again. Silence, the kind that ends arguments before they begin. But as the acquaintance turned away with a scoff, the guardian felt something shift. Not doubt, not regret, but awareness. Sometimes, detachment doesn't end a battle. It simply changes its shape. But what happens when indifference is mistaken for weakness? The harder they push, the more I sink into stillness. It started with a calendar shift. A routine meeting moved, then doubled in length. The guardian entered the glass-walled room with notes in hand and a calm breath, expecting the usual updates. Instead, they were met with sharpened glances and papers shuffled like weapons. The team lead cleared his throat. "Before we begin, some concerns were raised about project delays." Eyes turned. Someone spoke. "Actually, I think the issue is communication, or lack thereof." Lips curled, eyebrows lifted. The guardian knew the look. This wasn't a meeting. It was a tribunal. For a moment, they wanted to respond, to explain timelines, to reference emails, to pull out the spreadsheet that confirmed what had really happened. But something deeper stirred, an echo of Seneca's wisdom. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. So they listened. As voices layered, critique turned personal, tone shifted from process to personality. There were moments of sarcasm dressed as suggestions, smirks wrapped around accusations. Still, the guardian sat unmoved, not passive, present. When asked directly to explain, they spoke briefly, with measured tone. No defense, just facts. "That's your version," someone said, unimpressed. "It's what happened," they replied, still composed. The room shifted. Expectation hung thick. They wanted more. A rise, a flash of hurt, a crack in the facade. But none came. The meeting ended without resolution, just dispersal. Paper cups discarded, tension folded into laptops. As the others left, the guardian remained seated for a beat longer. Their hands were steady, their breath calm. But inside, a tremor. The cost of stillness was rising. Later that evening, alone at home, the guardian stood at the kitchen sink, water running warm over quiet hands. The confrontation replayed, not the words, but the silences. They wondered, briefly, if their silence had seemed weak, if their refusal to engage had opened space for more disrespect. But then came another memory. Seneca again. "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. And what greater waste than the endless defense of the self to those who wish only to misunderstand?" The guardian turned off the tap, sat down with their journal, wrote, "I chose not to defend because some attacks are not about truth, but power. I chose not to argue because the moment I do, I've accepted their frame. I chose stillness because it is mine." They exhaled. The next day, the team lead sent a curt message. "We'll revisit this in tomorrow's meeting." Of course they would. The guardian closed the laptop gently. No tension, no fury. Let them come. Let them accuse, escalate, provoke. Let them demand performance. The guardian had chosen silence not to hide, but to stand where nothing could be taken. A kind of strength invisible to those who measure power by noise. Still, something lingered. A quiet recognition. Silence may protect, but it does not always connect. It does not always explain. And sometimes, it is mistaken. But silence isn't always an answer. Sometimes it's the question. Not all battles are fought. Some are simply left behind. It came quietly, like most endings do, not with an argument, not with slammed doors, but with a moment of clarity that didn't require explanation. The guardian stood by the window, phone in hand, an unsent message glowing in the fading light. The words were honest, thoughtful, a final attempt to bridge a widening gap, but they knew it wouldn't land. It never had. The person on the other end, an old friend, once close, had become a master of subtle control. Their warmth came with conditions. Their praise arrived only after compliance. Conversations felt like negotiations, affection laced with ownership. At first, the guardian thought they could fix it. That clarity, kindness, and patience would transform the dynamic. But months passed, and each interaction left them feeling smaller, diminished. So today, the message remained unsent. The guardian watched the cursor blink, then slowly pressed delete. It wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. Outside, the wind moved through trees with the same rhythm it always had. Inside, something shifted. They stepped away from the window and pulled on their coat. The park nearby was quiet, paths damp with late afternoon rain. As they walked, a quote returned. This one from Epictetus. "You may not control the world, but you can control how you walk through it." And so they walked. Not away from someone, but toward themselves. Each step echoed with release. No more decoding passive remarks. No more justifying joy. No more shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. They didn't feel bitter. There was sadness, yes. But underneath that, freedom. Along the path, memories surfaced. Birthdays shared, laughter echoing in busy cafes, long conversations under streetlights. These were not lies. They were simply unfinished. People do not always grow together, and sometimes one person stops growing entirely. The guardian had tried, had hoped, had offered every peaceful tool Stoicism had given them. Patience, boundaries, silence, presence. But some storms are not to be weathered, they are to be stepped away from. The wind picked up slightly, leaves scattered across the path. A child laughed in the distance. Life moved forward, indifferent to inner revelations. The guardian smiled softly. Later that evening, they lit a single candle. No words, no rituals, just stillness. The absence of noise that once filled their thoughts now opened a kind of space they hadn't expected. Not emptiness, not loneliness. Room. Room for something new. For peace. For self. For the first time in a long while, they felt no need to explain their decision, not even to themselves. The door had closed, and that was enough. So what becomes of the space they used to fill? I have no armor now, only stillness. And a garden. Morning light spilled across the windowsill, gentle and warm. The guardian sat with the notebook in hand, steam rising from a cup beside them. The city stirred beyond the glass, but inside all was calm. There was no looming confrontation, no unsent message, no breath held in anticipation. Just the slow ritual of presence. They wrote not to remember, but to release. The words flowed simply, gratitudes, observations, quiet thoughts. A meditation of sorts, in ink. Once, this time of day had been filled with dread, with mental rehearsals for battles yet to come, with calculations, how to respond, when to withdraw, how to stay kind without becoming small. But now the day began not with defense, but with cultivation. The guardian had turned inward, not to retreat, but to rebuild, not to escape the world, but to meet it more clearly. They walked each day, sometimes in the park, sometimes just to the corner and back. Not far, just far enough to notice the wind, the texture of leaves, the rhythm of their breath. They read too, not to arm themselves with quotes, but to soak in the stillness others had once found. Marcus, Seneca, Epictetus. Their voices had become companions, not commanders. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. The guardian smiled, remembering that line. There were still difficult people. The colleague who sighed dramatically in meetings. The friend who sent sporadic guilt-laced messages. But they no longer owned space in the citadel. They were observed like weather, noted, felt, and let go. and in their place, new things had taken root. Long walks replaced long arguments. Journaling replaced justifying. Solitude no longer felt like lack, but like sanctuary. Evenings now ended not in overthinking, but in simple reflection. What did I protect today? What did I plant? The guardian began to see their life as a garden. Some things had been pruned, others had bloomed unexpectedly. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. There were moments of temptation, of course, to reach back, to re-engage, to fix. But those moments passed like clouds. No need to chase them. Instead, they watered what grew. Gratitude, clarity, compassion, especially for themselves. The guardian knew storms would come again. The world hadn't changed. People would still provoke, still misunderstand, still rage. But the citadel was no longer a fortress built of stone and silence. It was a garden tended daily, with care, with choice, with peace. And from this place they would meet whatever came next. And if tomorrow brings another storm, let it. The garden waits in silence, even after the storm has passed. Dew clings to the leaves, unshaken, as morning light filters gently through the trees. Strength, the Stoics remind us, is not in resistance alone, but in the quiet, repeated choice to tend what grows within. Perhaps today you will pause, not to fight, not to flee, but to notice what deserves your care. And in that noticing, peace begins.